It's NBA playoff time, and that means that there's a lot of myths going around about betting on the NBA playoffs. And to help you out, we're here with Mythbusters. My name is Matt Moore. I'm a senior NBA writer for the Action Network. I'm joined by Gilles Gallant. You can catch him on Twitter and the Action Network app. Make sure to follow all his great stuff. You know him from Action Island. You know him from NFL props, touchdown scorers, all sorts of stuff. And he's helping us out with the NBA playoffs as well. Gilles, we got to talk a little bit about this because it's the NBA playoffs, and so there's a lot more attention, and everybody's getting in on it. And bettors that haven't paid attention to the NBA all year will get in on it. And man, I will tell you, the common narratives are oftentimes the biggest ones bet. And in the NBA, there's no bigger narrative than the star players.
And that's exactly where I wanted to start with this today, Matt, because us being in the sports betting industry, we have friends in the industry, but we also have a lot of friends who aren't betting like that and are not in the weeds the way that we are and looking at these lines and looking at these past performances. So a lot of the time when I'm talking about the NBA, I'll hear these kind of almost like blanket statements that kind of throw me for a loop. And it's usually like barroom talk, like, talking head kind of points. Like Anthony Edwards is who I want to look at here because Anthony Edwards is the next one. We all want him to be the next one. He's 22 years old, couple-time All-Star. But one of these blanket statements that I always hear is take Anthony Edwards overs, especially in the playoffs. He's the next man up. He's got that look of MJ. Like, he's going to be the one who's the next great American-born player. And I just don't know if I can get with that, Matt. So I want to know this myth. Should we just take Anthony Edwards overs? Specifically, let's start with like points market. Should we just take Anthony Edwards overs in playoff games?
So for me, that entirely comes down to what do I think about the matchup? What do I think about the opposing team? I look at matchup data that I've seen previously from the regular season, even though that's sometimes noisy. And the other thing I think is like really like for me, it's all about coverages. It's what am I expecting from the opposing team in terms of how are they going to guard this guy? If I think that there's an edge in what he's going to be able to provide, then that changes things. You got to, for me, you got to start with like what kind of defenders do well on him? What kind of defenders does he take advantage of? And with Ant, there are very clear kind of ideas of who he attacks and when, depending on the matchup. And I think that's, to me, that's like the way to go about this. It is, there are players that will just simply rise above any sort of level of matchup or scheme against them. Ant's not there yet. He might get there, but to me, Gilles, Ant's not there yet.
And that's the thing is that usually the statement is like, all right, go for the ladder, go for 30 plus points. Maybe he'll even put up 40. Guys basically trying to convince me to ladder up points because right now the over underline for game one playing against the Suns is around 25.5. But the one thing that I would just counter with a lot of those blanket statements is kind of look of how Anthony Edwards has played, especially in the last month, especially since the All-Star break. His three-point shot, especially from last year to this year, and I've been watching the Wolves a lot more, obviously, now because they're, a little bit more front runner. They're a little more fun to watch. But his three-point shot is starting to regress. He's only shooting 30% from 3 points since the All-Star break. And that makes up for a lot of those points, those higher end point values, like where you're looking at 30 or 40. You've got to go 5 for 10 from 3, 6 for 10 from 3 to get to that. And we're not seeing those high end performances from the 3-point line. Also, if you look at the matchup, I know, again, some of it can be noisy, but pretty recent sample size of them playing Phoenix twice in April. And Phoenix just seems to have his number. In 3 games this year, he averaged 14 points per game. And I think the T-Wolves, too, as well, their roster is adapted, especially with now Cat coming back. I think that could even mess up a little bit of the offensive flow. And there's just a little bit more offensive options on the Timberwolves that require shots. Like Naz Reid deserves more shots now. Jaden McDaniels is taking more shots than he was last year. Mike Conley is now taking more threes. For me, I know that we could just look at, okay, Anthony Edwards has played 11 games in the playoffs. He has 28 points per game in those 11 playoff games. He's bound to go for 30 at least in game one and going forward in this series. And I would just caution bettors to be careful on just assuming that a star player is going to be a star player in a playoff series.
Absolutely. I think that it's important to kind of keep in mind how these narratives kind of shape this. This is also, look, I think we've gotten, the betting space has gotten a lot smarter in general in terms of where the public is and the sharp side, because we've got resources like Action Network, et cetera, to be able to change these kind of directions. I do think star players is one where we do have like the public perception of like, oh man, like you said, like, oh man, Ant's gonna go off this weekend. Like, okay, my thing with this is always it's the number, right? Like how much is the number anticipating that? And you can track like where these things open and close. You've also got a props tool in the Action Network app that's going to tell you the trends of how he's performed over the last month, like Gilles talked about, and in these matchups, etc. A lot of this, and I will say, the playoffs will show a lot of these things where there are exceptions where certain players that have not been a big part of the offense become much bigger because of how these teams are defending them. And guys that may have had big seasons might play a lot lower roles based off of that. And I think with Anthony Edwards, it's a good question of how are the Phoenix Suns going to guard him? How are the various teams in the playoffs going to defend him? And what's the number going to be set at? Because like you said, there's a lot of talk about the next Michael Jordan. That seems to me like a prime spot to maybe be fading.
Yeah, very preliminary. And I think as well, I mean, we could even look back, like MJ was what, 22 when he came into the league? Like it took him like 2 or 3 years just to get into the playoffs, and then all the playoff failures before finally we're seeing him get over the hump. I take those comparisons very seriously. And I find a lot of the time, because we get so enamored with these highlights of just dunking on people and making these super athletic plays, we want it to be real. We want to will this to happen. And I'm trying to explain to bettors, you can't will a bet to win. Do you know what I mean? Just because you think Anthony Edwards is really good, we all think Anthony Edwards is really good. But if it's set at 25.5, and right now he is just not playing well against a Phoenix Suns small ball team that just seems to be able to wrap themselves around the Timberwolves defensively, that I just can't get there with just saying we got to assume that Anthony Edwards is just going to go off because it's a playoff game.
All right, this has been Mythbusters from the Action Network. Make sure to follow us at youtube.com/the Action Network for more. Enjoy the NBA playoffs.